The city square was always loud, even on cold days. Buses stopped and started, horns sounded. Shoes hit the pavement in a steady rhythm, and voices blended into one constant noise. People walked fast, their eyes fixed on their phones or the road ahead. Most of them had places to go and problems of their own. Very few noticed the man sitting near the old public piano. He sat on a low concrete step, slightly hunched, pulling his thin jacket tighter around himself. The jacket had once been dark, but now it was faded and torn at the sleeves. His shoes were worn down, the soles almost flat. His face showed the marks of many hard years, not just from the weather, but from long nights without rest and days without hope. A small bag rested beside him, holding everything he owned. To most people, he was invisible. Some passed close enough to smell the sharp cold on his clothes and quickly stepped away. Others looked for a second and then turned their eyes somewhere else, uncomfortable. A few whispered words they thought he could not hear. Words like lazy, drunk, or trouble. No one asked his name. No one wondered how he ended up there. The piano stood a few feet away, covered in scratches and faded paint. It had been placed there years ago as part of a city project to bring art into public spaces. At first, people played it often. Children banged on the keys, street performers tried to impress crowds, and office workers pressed a few notes during lunch breaks. But over time, the piano became part of the background. Most days it sat silent. The man had been watching that piano for a long time. He came to the square often, not because he expected kindness, but because it was safer than many other places. Security guards walked around, and lights stayed on late. He usually stayed quiet, keeping to himself, knowing that drawing attention could bring trouble. Still, every time he looked at the piano, something inside his chest tightened. He told himself not to think about it. Years ago, music had been a part of his life. Not in a grand or famous way, but in a real one. Music had once filled small rooms, late evenings, and moments when words were not enough. Back then, he had believed life would move forward in a straight line. He believed hard work would be enough. He believed things would last. Life proved him wrong. One bad turn had led to another. A job loss, a broken relationship, a place to live that slowly slipped away. Each loss felt small at the time, but together they crushed him. Pride kept him from asking for help until it was too late. Before he realized it, the streets became his home. On the street, you learn quickly that people see only what they want to see. They see dirt, not effort. They see failure, not survival. He learned to stay quiet, to take up as little space as possible. The less you are noticed, the safer you are. Still, the piano pulled at him. That afternoon, the cold felt sharper than usual. Wind moved through the square, cutting between buildings and slipping under coats. The man rubbed his hands together, trying to warm his fingers. They were stiff and cracked, marked by cold and time. He flexed them slowly, feeling a dull ache in his joints. A group of people stood near the piano, laughing and talking. One of them pressed a few random keys, creating a loud, careless sound. They laughed and walked away, leaving the piano alone again. The man watched them go. A memory rose without warning, the feeling of smooth keys under his fingers. The way sound filled the air when played with care. He pushed the thought away. That was another life. Thinking about it only made the present hurt more. Nearby, a security guard leaned against a pole, scanning the crowd. The guard's eyes moved over the square and paused briefly on the man. Not with concern, but with suspicion. The look said, "I'm watching you." The man lowered his gaze. He had learned that guards often expected the worst. They saw people like him as problems waiting to happen. A wrong move could mean being told to leave, or worse. Still, his eyes drifted back to the piano. Minutes passed. People came and went. The sky slowly shifted, clouds thickening as the afternoon moved on. The man's stomach growled softly. He ignored it. Hunger had become familiar, like an unwanted companion that never left. A woman walking by slowed her pace and glanced at him. For a brief moment their eyes met. Her expression tightened, and she stepped away, clutching her bag closer. The man felt the familiar sting of that reaction. He looked down again, pretending not to notice inside. Something heavy settled in his chest. He was tired, not just from the cold or hunger, but from being unseen as a person, from being judged without a word spoken. From feeling like his past no longer mattered, he shifted on the concrete step and stood up slowly, his knees stiff. Standing too fast made his head spin, so he paused, breathing carefully. Around him, no one paid attention. To them, he was just moving from one spot to another. He took one step toward the piano, then stopped. A voice inside him warned him to stay back. Don't draw attention. Don't give them a reason to stare or laugh. He had seen what happened to others who tried to do more than survive. The crowd could be cruel. Phones came out fast when someone wanted entertainment. He looked at his hands again. They trembled slightly, whether from cold or fear, he couldn't tell. He remembered what those hands used to do, how they once felt strong and sure. Now they looked old, even though he wasn't. He took another step. A few people noticed him now. A man waiting for the bus glanced over and raised an eyebrow. Two teenagers nudged each other and whispered. Their faces showed amusement, not interest. The security guard straightened, watching more closely. The man felt every pair of eyes like weight pressing down on him. His heart beat faster. He could turn back, sit down again, pretend this moment never happened, but something stopped him. Maybe it was the long years of silence. Maybe it was the cold, making him feel like he had nothing left to lose. Or maybe it was the piano itself, waiting quietly, asking nothing but honesty. He reached the bench and stood there, unsure. The piano keys were uncovered, slightly yellowed but intact. Up close, he could see small chips and cracks. It wasn't perfect. Neither was he. People slowed as they passed. A small crowd formed without meaning to. Some looked curious. Others looked ready to laugh. One person lifted a phone, already smiling. The man swallowed hard. He didn't sit down yet. He just stood there, breathing, feeling the moment stretch longer than it should. Doubt pressed in from all sides. He imagined the sound of wrong notes, stiff fingers, the laughter following him as he walked away. The security guard took a step closer. Arms crossed. The man felt his face grow warm despite the cold. His chest tightened. He could hear his own breath, shallow and fast. For a second, he closed his eyes. When he opened them, he saw not the crowd, but the piano. Slowly, carefully, he lowered himself onto the bench. The wood creaked under his weight. The sound felt loud in the quiet space that had formed around him. Someone laughed softly. He placed his hands above the keys, not touching them yet. His fingers hovered, unsure, as if asking permission. The noise of the square seemed distant now, muted by his focus. This was the moment. He didn't know what would happen next. He didn't know if his hands would remember what his heart never forgot. He only knew that once. Long ago, music had given him a voice when words failed. And for the first time in years, he was about to listen to that voice again. The man sat on the bench, his hands hovering over the piano keys, feeling the smoothness of the worn ivory beneath his fingers. He had not touched a piano in years, not in any serious way, not in a place where anyone could see him. Every time he had wanted to play, circumstances, fear, or embarrassment had stopped him. Today was no different, and yet it felt different. Something inside him pushed him forward. A quiet voice reminding him that this was his chance, however small, to reclaim a piece of himself. Around him, the square continued to move. People passed by in hurried steps, some glancing curiously at him, some pretending not to notice. A few whispered to each other, their tones laced with amusement or doubt. "What is he doing?" one woman asked, her voice barely above a murmur. Another man shook his head and laughed quietly, as if expecting a disaster. Phones were already being lifted, fingers poised to record something they expected to be ridiculous. He took a deep breath and let it out slowly, feeling the chill of the winter air fill his lungs. His fingers trembled slightly, more from nerves than the cold. He flexed them, recalling the movements that once felt natural. Years of disuse had not erased the memory completely, but they had dulled it. Every joint protested as he tried to remember the positions. The flow, the subtle pressure needed for each note. A young couple paused nearby, their conversation halting as they noticed him. The woman tilted her head, her eyes curious. The man smirked, leaning toward her. "He's going to mess it up," he said, loud enough for the man to hear. The man's stomach tightened, and he could feel the heat rising to his face. He almost turned away, almost gave in to the familiar urge to hide, to vanish, to pretend he was nothing more than the tired, ragged figure people assumed he was, but he did not move. Instead, he let his hands settle lightly on the keys. The crowd had grown slightly. A few more people had stopped to watch, drawn by the anticipation, or perhaps by the expectation of entertainment. Some were whispering to each other, some were nudging their companions, and one or two were silently observing, unsure what to think. The security guard had shifted his stance, arms crossed, narrowing slightly. The man closed his eyes for a moment, remembering the music he had once loved. It was not a famous song, not a grand composition, but it carried all the weight of his memories, all the emotions he had buried. He could feel it in his chest, in the tips of his fingers, in the quiet rhythm of his heartbeat. For a moment he allowed himself to be vulnerable, to acknowledge the longing, the sadness, and the hope that had survived the years of struggle. Then he pressed a key. The note rang out, clear and soft, carrying a resonance that seemed impossible for someone in his condition. It was not perfect. A slight hesitancy lingered, but it held something more important: honesty. The sound caught a few passers-by by surprise. A man walking past paused mid-step, his phone lowering slowly. A child's mother stopped, lifting her child's head to look at him. The air in the square seemed to shift, as if it had been waiting for this moment. He continued, one note at a time, slowly, carefully, testing his memory. His hands were stiff, and his fingers stumbled occasionally. But each mistake was corrected, each hesitation replaced by growing confidence. He could feel the music returning, not just in his hands, but in his mind. In the space between his thoughts, filling the emptiness he had carried for so long, a few people laughed quietly at first, unable to contain themselves. They whispered about his appearance, about how ridiculous it looked to see a homeless man attempting to play a piano in the middle of a busy square. "Watch this," one young man muttered to his friend. "He's going to ruin it." The man ignored them. He could feel the doubt in their eyes, the expectation of failure, and for the first time, he let it fuel him instead of break him. He pressed another key, then another, forming a simple sequence of notes. The sound grew more confident, more fluid. His fingers moved with a rhythm he had not felt in years, and slowly, something extraordinary began to happen. The laughter faltered, curiosity replaced mockery, and the attention of the crowd shifted. People stopped walking past so quickly. Some tilted their heads, unsure what they were hearing. A young woman, standing near the edge of the growing crowd, whispered to herself, "He can play." Her voice was barely audible, but it carried a sense of wonder that spread quietly to those around her. The man's confidence grew with each note. He no longer saw the people watching him as critics, he saw them as witnesses. Each sound he produced was not about proving anything to them, but about reclaiming a piece of himself. Music had always been more than entertainment for him. It was a language, a way to communicate when words were insufficient. Now, years later, it was his voice again, and for the first time in a long time, it felt alive. The security guard shifted, his arms uncrossed slightly, his expression unreadable. He had seen street performers before, but there was something different here. The music was deliberate, careful, and full of emotion. It demanded attention without demanding anything else. Even the teens who had been smirking moments ago slowed their laughter, unsure how to react. The man's fingers moved more confidently now. He had found the flow, the rhythm, the heartbeat of the music. Each note carried emotion, a mixture of longing, pain, and hope. The music filled the square, weaving through the sounds of buses, conversations, and footsteps, creating a pocket of silence around him. People instinctively leaned closer, drawn by something they could not explain, A woman with a stroller stopped nearby, her eyes wide. "I didn't expect that," she whispered. The child looked curiously at the piano, reaching toward it. The man smiled faintly, almost without realizing it, his heart lifting slightly at the simple gesture of connection. Someone in the back of the crowd whispered, "He's really good." Another nodded, their skepticism beginning to fade. Phones were still raised, but the expressions on the faces holding them had changed. They were no longer waiting for failure. They were witnessing something unexpected, something real. The man closed his eyes again, letting the music guide him. He played not for applause, not for recognition, not for the crowd that had gathered, but for himself. Each note was a reminder that despite everything, despite the years of hardship and loss, a part of him had survived. The piano did not judge him. The music did not mock him. For the first time in a long time, he felt whole, if only for a few minutes. A young boy pushed forward through the crowd, eyes shining. "Can he play more?" he asked his mother. She nodded, smiling softly, and he whispered thanks before sitting quietly on the curb to listen. Others followed suit, sitting or standing still, caught in the magic of the moment. Even the man himself was surprised at how easily the music came back. The notes were not perfect. Some stumbled, and the rhythm faltered at times, but the feeling behind them was undeniable. People around him could sense it, the honesty, the depth, the story behind each sound. Some closed their eyes, letting it wash over them. Others simply watched, their skepticism replaced by awe. Minutes passed like hours, yet the man hardly noticed. He was lost in the music, in the memory of who he had once been, and in the fragile hope of who he might still become. The cold air stung his cheeks, but he barely felt it. The weight of years, the loneliness, the hunger, the pain, all of it seemed to fade with each note he played. A small applause broke out. Soft at first, then louder as more people joined in. The man opened his eyes, startled by the sudden recognition. He glanced at the crowd, feeling a mix of embarrassment and relief. They were not laughing anymore. They were clapping, smiling, some even cheering quietly. The laughter of the teens had disappeared. The man who had doubted him earlier lowered his phone, his expression unreadable but thoughtful. Even the security guard's stance had softened, as if realizing that this was not trouble. Not a scene to be broken up, but something genuine, something human. The man continued to play, letting the music fill the air, filling the space around him and the space inside him. Every note was a small victory, every chord a reclaiming of dignity, of identity, of hope. The crowd no longer mattered. The music mattered. The piano, long ignored, had become alive again, just as he had, just for a few minutes. Just for this moment. For the first time in a long time. He felt seen, not for who people assumed he was, but for what he could do, for the soul behind the worn jacket and tired face. He did not stop when applause broke out. He let it flow around him, letting it carry the music further, letting it remind him that even in the hardest moments, even when judged and dismissed, there was still beauty, still possibility, and as he played, the square transformed. People stopped rushing. Conversations quieted. Eyes were wide with wonder. Phones lowered, replaced by attention and admiration. The homeless man, the figure no one had noticed before, had become the center of something extraordinary, not because of fame or wealth, but because he dared to do what no one expected, to play, to express, to remind the world that talent, heart, and humanity can exist anywhere, even where people least expect it. He did not know what would happen next. He did not know if the music would continue to guide him beyond this square, beyond this cold winter afternoon. All he knew was that for now, in this moment, he had reclaimed a part of himself, and in doing so, he had quietly begun to change the world around him, one note at a time. The man's hands moved over the piano keys with growing confidence, each note resonating through the square like a small private miracle. He had started carefully testing his memory, but now his fingers flowed freely, brushing over the keys as if they remembered every melody he had ever played. The sound was soft at first, gentle and cautious, but it soon gained strength, filling the air with a warmth that contrasted with the chill of the winter day. People around him began to notice more than the act itself. They noticed the emotion behind the notes. The man's face was still worn and tired, but his eyes had a spark. The sadness and struggle that had shaped his life seemed to pour into every chord. Each note carried a story, a fragment of his past that had never been spoken aloud. Some people stopped mid-step, captivated not just by the music but by the sincerity of it. A mother holding her child at the edge of the crowd whispered to the boy, "Listen. Really, listen." The child leaned forward, wide-eyed, gripping his mother's coat. Even in such a busy and different city, the music created a small bubble of stillness, a place where time slowed and hearts opened. The man's fingers glided over the keys, sometimes hesitating, sometimes striking with precision, but always with feeling. A few skeptical bystanders shifted uncomfortably. One man muttered under his breath, "He's good. Maybe too good." Another shook his head, incredulous, but unable to turn away. Laughter and ridicule had disappeared. No one dared mock him anymore, not when the music carried such depth. It was as if every note demanded respect, and even the harshest critics had to listen. The man did not notice the crowd growing around him. People had stopped rushing to appointments and errands. They leaned on benches, crouched on curbs, or stood quietly at the edges, their eyes fixed on him. Phones were held up, not for ridicule, but to capture something extraordinary. The sound of the piano overpowered the city's usual clatter. Creating a fragile, suspended world where only music mattered, he closed his eyes, letting the melody guide him. Memories he had long buried surfaced with the notes. He remembered the small recital halls, the applause that had once meant everything, the pride in a teacher's eyes, the quiet joy of creating something beautiful. Those memories had been pushed aside by hardship, by loneliness, by survival. Now they returned. Mingling with the cold air and the soft murmur of the crowd, a teenager in the crowd whispered to his friend, "Do you hear that? He's amazing." The friend nodded silently, unable to believe what he was seeing. The piano no longer seemed like an ordinary instrument in a city square. It had become a bridge, a lifeline connecting the man's past with the present. Connecting him with everyone who stopped to listen. The man's fingers moved faster, more confidently now. The hesitations of the first notes were gone, placed by an instinctive flow that seemed to come from memory and heart, not from thought. The music swelled, rising and falling like waves, carrying emotion that was impossible to ignore. People felt it in their chests, a subtle vibration that left them breathless. Some closed their eyes, letting the sound wash over them. Others watched, mesmerized by the precision and passion in his playing. Even the security guard, who had been skeptical and tense, leaned against the pole, arms crossed, listening intently. His expression had softened into something that resembled awe. He had seen performers before, seen street musicians try to impress crowds, but none had commanded attention like this. None had seemed to pour themselves so completely into their art. The man was lost in the music. Each note became a sentence, each chord a paragraph in a story he had never shared. He was not playing to prove anything to the crowd or to silence the whispers of doubt. He was playing because it was the one thing that made him feel alive. It's the one thing that reminded him he had worth beyond the judgments of strangers. Some people in the crowd began to murmur softly to each other. "He's incredible," one woman said, her voice trembling. "I never expected." "That," another added. A man standing near a coffee cart shook his head in disbelief, muttering, How can someone living like that play like this?" The music had transformed the way they saw him. He was no longer just a homeless man. He was an artist, a storyteller, human being whose life could not be measured by appearances alone. The man pressed on, weaving complexity into his playing. The notes were no longer simple or cautious. They carried layers of emotion, subtle shifts in tone and tempo that showed skill, experience, and passion. His fingers danced over the keys, some moving rapidly, some lingering for emphasis. Each phrase seemed to echo both joy and sorrow, hope and regret, leaving the crowd in silent awe, A little girl in a pink coat tugged at her mother's sleeve. "Mom, he's really playing, really?" she said, her eyes wide with wonder. Her mother smiled, brushing her hair back. "Yes, he is," she whispered. "Listen carefully." The child nodded, crouching to watch his hands move over the keys. Even children, unspoiled by judgment, sensed the truth in his music. The man's eyes remained closed. He was no longer aware of the cold or the strangers. He was aware only of the sound, the rhythm, and the feeling of the music flowing through him. Years of pain, hunger, and isolation seemed to melt away, replaced by a fragile sense of connection. For a moment, he was not a man who had lost everything. He was a man who had found his voice again. A few people in the crowd began to clap softly, almost afraid to break the spell. One person tapped a foot in rhythm, another nodded in quiet admiration. The applause grew tentative at first, then more confident as others joined in. It was not the loud, performative applause of a theater, but something warmer, more human. It was a recognition of effort, of emotion, of survival. The man opened his eyes briefly, surprised by the growing crowd. He had expected a few curious onlookers, maybe some laughter or indifference. But this was different. They were not mocking him. They were listening. They were paying attention. They were acknowledging the part of him that had survived, that had refused to give up, that had remembered how to create something beautiful even when life seemed determined to take it all away. He leaned into the piano, letting the music flow naturally. His hands moved with confidence and precision, creating melodies that filled the square like sunlight breaking through clouds. People stopped walking, their daily routines forgotten for a few minutes. Strangers exchanged glances, sharing silent acknowledgement of the beauty unfolding before them. The man felt something stirring deep within him. It was a mixture of relief, joy, and disbelief. He had played before, of course, but never like this. Never in front of people who had no reason to believe in him. The music was no longer just sound. It was proof that he still mattered, proof that the world could see him as more than a tired, ragged figure. A young man in the back of the crowd whispered, He's amazing. I never thought. His words trailed off as the music swelled. Nearby, an older woman wiped a tear from her eye, smiling faintly. Some people whispered to each other, sharing their amazement, their disbelief, their newfound respect. The man did not notice them. He noticed only the piano, the feel of the keys beneath his fingers, the way the sound traveled through the square, touching everyone in different ways. Each note carried a fragment of his life, struggles, regrets, hopes, and dreams, and each note seemed to be received, understood, even by strangers. The music became more complex, shifting in rhythm and tempo. He allowed himself to experiment, to weave in subtle flourishes and intricate passages. His fingers moved with fluidity, recalling long-forgotten techniques, creating harmonies that resonated with the crowd. People whispered among themselves, marveling at how someone who appeared so broken could produce such mastery. Even the security guard, who had watched skeptically at first, now stood quietly, arms at his sides, watching intently. He had expected chaos, perhaps a clumsy attempt at performance, maybe even trouble. Instead, he witnessed something rare, something human and beautiful that could not be ignored. The man's heart pounded, not from exertion but from the overwhelming feeling of connection. He felt seen, understood, and appreciated in a way he had not felt in years. Music had always been his sanctuary, but now it had become a bridge between him and the world. The notes he played were no longer just sounds. They were words, messages, and emotions shared with everyone around him. A woman in the crowd whispered, "It's like he's telling a story." Without words, others nodded in agreement. People had come expecting distraction or amusement, and instead, they had found something deeply moving. The music had silenced the city square, quieted the usual chatter and noise, and created a shared space of empathy and wonder. The man's fingers did not falter. Each chord, each scale, each subtle change in volume and tempo carried a weight that the crowd could feel. The music was alive, and so was he. Years of struggle, of being overlooked, of being judged without understanding, seemed to pour into the keys and out into the world. The applause grew again, this time more confidently, more openly. Some people clapped softly, some raised their hands in admiration, others simply nodded, acknowledging the beauty and the skill. The man continued to play, not because of the recognition, but because he could, because it mattered to him. Because he had remembered that he still had something to give. The square had changed. The hurried steps, the indifferent glances, the casual whispers of doubt had all faded. In their place was attention, respect, and a shared moment of human connection. People had been drawn together by music, by the courage of one man to play despite everything, by the reminder that talent and humanity can exist in the most unexpected places. The man's heart lifted. Though he did not allow himself to show it too clearly, he knew the music would not last forever, that the crowd would eventually move on, and that he would still face the challenges of the street. But for now, he had reclaimed a piece of himself, shared it with the world, and reminded everyone that even in the harshest conditions, something beautiful could emerge. He leaned into the piano, letting the music continue, his fingers moving with confidence, skill, and emotion. The notes filled the air, carried by the wind through the square, reaching ears and hearts that had not expected to be touched. The crowd watched in awe, silent for the most part, letting the sound wash over them. And for the first time in many years, the man felt truly alive. The music continued to flow from the man's fingers, filling the square in a way that made every sound feel alive. He was no longer thinking about the people watching him, the judgments they had made, or the laughter he had once expected. He was thinking only of the music, of the story it told, of the emotion that had been buried inside him for years. Each note carried a fragment of his life, a memory, a hope, or a regret. And the people around him could feel it as clearly as if he were speaking to them without words. A woman standing near the edge of the crowd clutched her scarf and let her eyes close, letting the music wash over her. She felt the rise and fall of each note, the subtle changes in tempo, and the emotional weight behind every chord. It was as if the man had opened a window into his soul, and she, along with everyone else, was lucky enough to look inside. She had walked by, expecting nothing more than another street performer, maybe a momentary distraction. Instead, she felt something stirring deep within her chest. A mix of awe and empathy she had not expected. The little girl in the pink coat crouched closer to the piano, her eyes wide and bright. She leaned forward, trying to see the man's fingers as they danced over the keys. The music spoke to her in a way words never could. She had never seen anyone play like this before. Not on television, not in books, not even at school. The way his hands moved, the emotion he poured into every note, made the piano feel like it was alive. She felt a strange connection, a warmth that made her forget the cold wind biting at her cheeks. Some of the adults in the crowd began to wipe away tears. They did not know the man's story, but they understood it in the way people understand art. It spoke to universal experiences: struggle, hope, loss, and the simple joy of creation. One woman whispered to her friend, "I can feel everything he's felt." Just by listening, the friend nodded silently, unable to put the sensation into words. They had expected a spectacle, but instead they received something far more profound: honesty. Even the teens who had initially laughed now watched in silence. Their phones were still raised, recording the moment, but their expressions were no longer mocking. There was disbelief on their faces, mixed with admiration. Some of them exchanged glances, silently acknowledging that they had misjudged him. One of them muttered under his breath, "I didn't think he could play like this." The other simply shook his head, unable to respond. The sound of the piano had done what words could not. It had erased assumptions and opened eyes. The man's heart pounded as he played. He had not intended to shock anyone, but he realized he had done so. The faces in the crowd reflected a mix of astonishment, respect, and emotion he had not expected. He was not performing for applause or recognition. He was performing because he had to. Music had always been the place where he felt free, where he could express himself without fear. And today, it had brought him back to life. The security guard, who had been tense and skeptical at first, now stood quietly, his arms at his sides. He was not moving to stop the man. He was listening, truly listening, in a way that few had bothered to do. The music had softened the guard's rigid stance, replaced suspicion with something like wonder. He realized that this man, whom he had once judged as a potential problem, was something far more remarkable. A human being sharing a piece of himself with the world. A middle-aged man in a business suit leaned against a lamppost, his briefcase at his feet. He had been rushing to a meeting, expecting the usual noise and chaos of the city square. Now he was frozen, captivated by the unexpected beauty. He felt a lump in his throat, a sensation he could not explain. The music was not just sound. It was a bridge to understanding, a reminder that life could hold unexpected moments of grace. The man's fingers moved with growing confidence. The melodies he played were intricate, yet natural, combining technical skill with raw emotion. He did not need to force the notes. They flowed effortlessly, as if the piano and he were connected by something deeper than memory or practice. Each chord resonated in the chest of every listener, vibrating in a way that made them feel the story without ever hearing a single word. A mother whispered to her young son, "He's telling a story with his music. Listen carefully." The boy nodded, captivated, and he crouched closer to the bench. He could feel the emotion, the struggle, and the hope that the music carried. The man's performance had turned the square into something more than a place for passing through. It had become a shared space of human connection, a moment suspended in time where judgment, hurry, and indifference were set aside. The man's mind drifted as he played. He remembered his life before the streets, the small apartment where he had practiced for hours. The teacher who had praised his progress, the friends who had shared his dreams. Those memories had been painful at times, reminders of what he had lost. Yet now, through the music, they felt like gifts. Each note was a thread connecting him to the person he once was, and each chord was a reminder that he could still be that person again. If only in moments like this, the crowd began to grow quieter. The city noise fading in comparison to the sound of the piano. Passers-by slowed, unable to resist the pull of the music. People stopped talking. People stopped walking. People stopped thinking about their own worries for a few minutes. They listened, fully present, experiencing something rare, the beauty that comes from someone daring to be vulnerable and honest in front of strangers. A young man whispered to his companion, "It's like he's speaking to us without words." The companion nodded, her eyes misty. Others in the crowd nodded in agreement, murmuring softly to each other about the skill, the feeling, and the courage it took to play in public after so many hardships. The man on the piano did not see them, yet he could feel their attention, their recognition, their quiet awe. The music swelled, reaching a peak that seemed to lift everyone in the square. The man's fingers flew over the keys, rapid but controlled, weaving together melodies and harmonies that carried both sadness and hope. People in the crowd were moved in different ways. Some felt tears forming in their eyes. Others felt a strange warmth in their hearts, and some simply watched, unable to comprehend the depth of what they were witnessing. The little girl in the pink coat held her mother's hand tightly, completely absorbed. She whispered, "He's amazing. I wish I could play like that." Her mother smiled, squeezing her hand. "It's not about being amazing, sweetheart. It's about feeling what he feels." The child nodded, eyes still fixed on the man and the piano. Trying to understand the emotions flowing through the music, the man continued to play, now more freely than ever. He experimented with dynamics, letting some notes ring out sharply, while others faded softly into the air. He added subtle pauses, creating tension and release, allowing the music to breathe. The crowd responded, sensing the deliberate intention behind each sound. Even without understanding the technicalities, they could feel the story unfolding. A teenager whispered to his friend, "I thought he was just some homeless guy. I didn't think he could be like this." The friend nodded, his phone lowered. The laughter from before had vanished completely, replaced by something quieter and more profound. Admiration. People who had come expecting distraction were now witnesses to something real and unforgettable. The man's heart swelled as he noticed the subtle changes in the crowd's demeanor. Eyes softened, shoulders relaxed, faces reflected emotion. Strangers were connected, not by words or gestures, but by the music. Even those who had been skeptical or dismissive had stopped judging. For the first time in a long time, the man felt seen not as a problem, not as a burden, but as a person with talent, emotion, and dignity. The security guard shifted, stepping slightly closer, yet he did not interfere. He realized that this was not a performance meant to disrupt the square or cause trouble. It was something more fragile and valuable, a human sharing their soul through music. The guard's expression softened as he watched. Understanding in a way he had not expected, the man's hands moved faster now, weaving a tapestry of notes that carried both precision and feeling. Each chord was deliberate, each passage intentional, yet the overall effect felt effortless. The music seemed to flow naturally, carrying with it the essence of everything he had been through. Pain, struggle, longing, and hope, all intertwined. Creating something that transcended simple melody, people in the crowd began to whisper to each other, sharing what they were feeling. "It's beautiful," one woman said, her voice trembling. "I've never heard anything like it," another added. Some nodded silently, letting the sound speak for itself. A few wiped tears from their eyes, overcome by the emotion. The man's focus never wavered. He was in a state of flow, completely absorbed in the music. He no longer felt the cold, the hunger, or the years of hardship pressing on him. In this moment, he was free. The music was a bridge, a safe place where he could exist fully as himself. Without judgment or fear, as the melody reached a particularly tender section, the crowd leaned closer. Even the teens who had been skeptical at first were silent, caught in the emotion of the performance. Someone whispered, "It's like he's speaking directly to each of us." Others nodded, unable to express in words what the music had conveyed. The man's fingers paused briefly on the keys, then resumed with renewed energy. The music rose and fell, carrying the crowd on an emotional journey they had not anticipated. The piano, once ignored and worn, now resonated with life. Echoing through the square and through the hearts of everyone present, each note was a testament to resilience, to courage, and to the human spirit. The man was no longer just a figure on the street. He had become a storyteller, a conduit for emotion, and a reminder of the beauty that can emerge from the most unlikely places. The crowd was fully captivated now. People who had come and gone lingered, drawn by the music, unable to leave. Conversations stopped entirely, replaced by a shared experience of wonder, empathy, and admiration. The square had transformed from a place of routine and indifference into a sanctuary of human connection. The man's heart beat in rhythm with the music. Each note was a release, each chord a confession. He felt alive in a way he had not felt for years. The crowd, without realizing it, had given him something invaluable: recognition of his humanity, acknowledgement of his talent, and acceptance without judgment. He continued to play, his fingers dancing over the keys with precision and emotion. The music rose to a final, powerful phrase, lingering in the air long after the last note was struck. The square fell silent for a heartbeat, the crowd holding their collective breath, unsure how to react to what they had just witnessed. Then, softly at first, applause began. One person clapped, then another, then more. The sound grew, gentle yet persistent, echoing through the square. The man looked up briefly, surprised, and then smiled faintly, humbled by the response. It was not the fame he had lost long ago, nor was it recognition he had sought, but it was something more profound: validation, human connection. In the quiet joy of sharing his soul through music, the people around him clapped and cheered, some wiping tears, others smiling, all acknowledging the extraordinary moment they had just witnessed. The man leaned back slightly, catching his breath, and allowed himself to feel a small but significant sense of triumph. In that moment, he was no longer invisible, no longer judged solely by his circumstances. He had reminded the world and himself that talent, emotion, and humanity can exist anywhere, even where it is least expected. The applause that had begun softly in the square grew louder, echoing against the buildings and streets. The man on the piano remained seated, hands hovering briefly above the keys, unsure whether he should continue. The crowd around him was no longer a mass of strangers. They were witnesses to something extraordinary. Their eyes shone with admiration, some filled with tears, others reflecting quiet wonder. For a moment, the man allowed himself to simply breathe and take it in. He had not expected this. Years of living on the street had taught him that most people either ignored him or judged him harshly. Kindness was rare, respect even rarer. But now, here he was, surrounded by strangers who had seen past the worn clothes, the tired face, and the ragged hands. They had seen something deeper, something that had survived despite all the hardships. The realization settled in slowly, almost uncomfortably. But it warmed him in a way he hadn't felt for years. The little girl in the pink coat looked up at him, her eyes wide and sparkling. She had been sitting quietly near the edge of the crowd, absorbed by the music from the beginning. Now she whispered to her mother, He's really amazing." Her mother smiled softly, squeezing her hand. "Yes," she whispered back, "and he's sharing that with all of us." The girl nodded, her small face reflecting both admiration and a quiet understanding that this was a rare and beautiful moment. Around the square, people were still whispering among themselves, their voices low, almost reverent. "I never expected," this one man said, shaking his head in disbelief. A woman nodded beside him, brushing a tear from her cheek. "Beautiful," she replied, her voice trembling slightly. They had come to the square with errands, meetings, or nothing in particular. And they had found something extraordinary instead. The man on the piano finally allowed himself to smile. Not a broad or forced smile, but a small, quiet one. It was the first time in years that he had felt this combination of relief, pride, and connection. He had played for himself, yes. But he had also played for something bigger, for recognition that did not come from wealth or status, but from humanity. Every note had been an act of courage, every chord a reminder of who he was beneath the layers of hardship and judgment. Some people stepped closer, drawn by the sound and the moment. They did not speak, did not interrupt, but their presence alone was acknowledgement. A young man with a camera lowered it from his face, letting himself watch and listen without the filter of